Pride/Prejudice, Chapter 2, Segment 1. Unfortunately for Fitz's resolve, the situation improved in a dangerous but subtle way that left him completely unguarded. Over the next several weeks, the gentlemen of Netherfield and the ladies of Longbourn came into frequent but public association, dinners, card parties, and the like, in which any sort of private conversation was impossible. Charles's continued praise of Miss Bennet grew tiresome, verging on the insupportable, but as it was all based on so insubstantial a foundation, Fitz didn't attempt to argue his friend out of what could only be hardened into obstinacy by opposition. So fragile a structure would crumble easily enough on its own, once the chance at greater intimacy was achieved, and the lady's shallow character was exposed. This occasion arose unexpectedly. Fitz, with Charles and his brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, had gone to dine with the newly arrived officers of the local militia. Fitz had been greatly looking forward to this outing, a chance to spend an informal evening in the company of men, no need to watch his every word, and, if he was very lucky indeed, he might find someone compatible, more than likely in the all-male world of the military. A surrogate for Charles when he was in one of his moods, which were becoming increasingly frequent. Not that there could be a substitute for love, but for mere sport, what harm in that? The ladies, left to themselves, and indulging their brother in his partiality, invited the eldest Miss Bennet to dinner. And what must the bitch do but travel on horseback, uncovered during autumn rain, and deliberately, as it seemed, catch cold? It would be inhuman to send her home, even Fitz was forced to admit that, and the next day her sister felt obligated to see how the invalid was doing. And that's when the trouble began. The woman walked, the entire 3 miles, through the mud and dirt, residue of the rain that had laid her sister low. She tripped daintily into the breakfast parlour, her eyes bright, her delicate complexion rosy and translucent. Fitz was aware not only of her face, but of her body, her chest expanding and contracting with deep breaths. So slender and light, she could be a boy. But no boy had such trim ankles, or little budding breasts with those sharp peaks of nipples pointing through the thin muslin of her gown. And no boy could look so graceful in the damp folds of drapery. And no boy had ever smelled quite like that. "Did you see her petticoat?" Louisa Hurst exclaimed in glee after Elizabeth Bennet had been directed upstairs to her sister's chamber. "My dear," Caroline Bingley replied, 6 inches deep in mud, and her shoes." "Sweating like a plough-horse," Louisa said. Louisa, Caroline, Charles, his courage steeled by first love, dared to admonish his formidable sisters. Miss Elizabeth's concern for her sister, if nothing else, demands our admiration, not our censure. Caroline, not at all chastened, turned to Fitz. "I'm sure, Mr. Darcy, you noticed her deplorable state." Fitz had one of those moments, rare for him, of spurious inspiration. "All I noticed," he said, allowing his voice to purr just a little, "is how the exercise heightened the glow in her very fine eyes." That gave those 2 cats something to think about. Oh, yes. But it was Fitz who was burdened with some rather troublesome thoughts after a day or 2 of the Bennet sisters' enforced stay. However dull the elder, the younger was unlike anything Fitz had encountered among the supposedly highest level of cultured society in town. Elizabeth Bennet seemed determined to make an impression. Not content with proving her country fortitude by walking, she took every opportunity to show off her unique and often contrary views on any commonplace subject that arose. She spent her time with her sister, rather than enjoying the conversation in the downstairs parlour, and chose a book over a game of loo, yet disdained the notion that she was any great reader, or preferred reading to all other pastimes. She took on Fitz at every turn, matching each of his attempted witticisms with her own adroit turns of phrase. What astonished Fitz more than anything was that her words were clearly original. He had never heard anything like them in the salons and ballrooms of London. She was not repeating the voguish phrases and the manner of forming them that prevailed in the fashionable soirees, nor was she likely to have spent enough time there to have studied them. And although she was undoubtedly well educated, Fitz had read widely enough to know she was not following any strange conversational plans out of some obsolete primer. On the second day, when the mother and younger sisters visited, exhibiting their lamentable and pitiable lack of intelligence, grace, and good manners, Fitz was jolted rudely awake from his unwary fascination. Mrs. Bennet was an unmitigated horror, and the thought that she had produced 5 daughters, 3 of them as empty-headed and shameless as herself, was enough to make Fitz give up the notion of having any more congress with females for the rest of his life. "There is quite as much of that in the country as in town," she said, with vulgar frankness, appearing to read Fitz's thoughts, and relishing the amount of immorality to be met with in her small village, before going on to boast of dining with 24 families, as if it were some great number. Seeing Elizabeth so quick to divert attention from her mother's worst lapses by serving them up as humorous vignettes of country life, Fitz could only turn away in sympathetic mortification. It was bizarre, revolting, like catching sight of a cripple or a leper, made all the worse by the contrast with her wit and feminine form. When the deformed creature is in other respects a beautiful woman, Fitz discovered, one's disgust is infinitely magnified. Once the mother and sisters were gone, however, Fitz found himself forgetting the distasteful incidents, surrounded as he was by all the new charms. It was when Elizabeth, innocently as it seemed, touched on his natural concern for Charles, that Fitz at last became rattled. He had been startled but amused at her rejection of poetry as encouragement to love, intrigued by her assertion that a puny love could be entirely starved away by one good sonnet. By then, no doubt encouraged by her mild success, and overconfident of her audience's goodwill, Elizabeth drew poor Charles, already in well over his head, into a pathetic and endearing assertion of his own headstrong disregard for caution. Charles declared, with a fervour that he no doubt fancied was showing himself as one of those fiery, passionate souls celebrated in the latest poetry and popular novels, that were he to resolve to quit Netherfield, he would be gone at once, with no second thoughts. Despite Fitz's misgivings that he was making too much of insignificant chat, he couldn't help stepping in. He heard the scorn in his voice, the affectionate criticism, but was unable to suppress it, as he reminded Charles that, in fact, were a friend to request that he change his mind, he would acquiesce. Charles had been abashed, then defiant, and Elizabeth had come to his defense as if Fitz had been attacking him, when his only intent had been to prevent Charles from looking ridiculous. It was intolerable, Fitz thought, as he realized that she was laughing at him, a mere chit of a girl, not a beauty in the established mode, with a meagre portion and a most tenuous position on the lowest rung of the country gentry, and with the sharpest tongue off a London stage he had ever had the pleasure of being assailed by, and the most striking, dark, large, and luminous eyes, and a very fetching, petite figure. Fitz could hardly keep his eyes off her. That was a disgrace, more his fault than hers. After all, he was an experienced man of the world, whereas she... It was not until the 3rd day that Fitz understood she was flirting. How slow he had been. Her unorthodox tactics had almost outmaneuvered him.